Welcome back to the Belonging Network Summit. Our featured belonging champion this morning is none other than the inspiring Bianca Laureano. Bianca is an award-winning sexuality educator and curriculum creator. She's also the foundress of Anti-Up, which is an organization that offers professional development and training for the world that we have inherited. Bianca started the organization as she noticed the needs of many communities doing justice work and finding limited support in their own growth and development. She imagined a virtual space for collective unlearning and accountability that honors shifts and the ebb and flow of collective webs of knowledge. I first encountered Bianca's work last year when I came across her intersectionality course that she developed for Anti-Up. Her course helps students understand the origins of intersectionality as a critical race theory, examines how systemic biases are baked into structures and institutions that adversely impact us as individuals, and most importantly, offers students everyday actions that they can take in using an intersectional approach in their work and life. Since today's focus is all about radical inclusion, I'll be asking Bianca to share her thoughts on intersectionality, moving beyond buzzwords to inspire those of us leading diversity, equity, and inclusion programming to resist building silos and instead build coalition and connections across cultural differences within our own organizations. And at the end of the talk, you will have some concrete strategies that you can act on that will help you take a more intersectional approach in your everyday work. Okay, so Bianca, with no further ado, welcome to the summit. I am thrilled that you are joining the belonging movement. So for the non-academics who are tuning in today, who might not be familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw's scholarship, how do you break down what intersectionality means in everyday language?
Absolutely. Yeah, intersectionality definitely came from a legal field out of Harvard. And so it's very academic, like you said. It is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it also is a theory and an analysis to understand oppression. I think that's one of the main reasons why people have such a hard time figuring out what to do with it, how to use it properly, and understand what's going on in an issue or the world that they want to examine. So the way that I talk about it is that intersectionality is an examination of the oppression that we experience, either as individuals or collectively, when we move through the world and have to deal with systems. So like the education system, the healthcare system, the criminal incarceration system. There's so many systems that we're surrounded by, and intersectionality helps us understand what's going on to specific communities that are in need and we should be listening to shift for equity.
Yeah, I think thank you. That's,
Yeah.
it's super simple, but not, right?
Yeah,
And so,
exactly.
and when it was kind of initially coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, she was using it specifically to describe, bias, discrimination, and violence that specifically targeting Black women.
Mm.
And today, if we Google the term right now, we can see that it's used more widely to describe each of us kind of in our own identities and how we intersect with power and oppression. And some aspects of our identities carry advantages while others carry disadvantages. So is this a misunderstanding of the term, or is this how it was originally intended to be used?
Yeah, so I think there's a difference between the term and how it's actually put into practice.
Yeah.
Because the term is one thing, but actually what it looks like in practice is very different from what Kimberly Crenshaw did in the legal field to what some people might be doing with like climate change today. So those are very different fields, but they can be guided by intersectional analysis to help understand a variety of different things that are going on. So I think it's important to note that, things like this kind of analysis and intersectional analysis has been done before. It just wasn't called this. Mm-hmm. So we have a variety of different examples of what that looks like historically. And that's something that we also need to honor and also recognize, okay, what are the ways that we don't live in the 80s or the 60s or the 40s anymore. And so what kind of conversations are shifting and changing? And what is the language that we're using? So I don't think it's a misunderstanding. I think it's more of a, an opportunity for learning a little bit more. I think it's really easy for us to put things in, biteable chunks. So it's easy for people to say, oh, it's about multiple identities. And yes, it is. And we all have multiple identities. And that's one of the critiques of intersectionality too, is that everybody gets to claim an oppression. And what I say to that is, absolutely, we live in a capitalist society that exploits people for their labor.
Yeah.
That's exactly how it works. This country that we live in the United States was built on exploration, conquest, colonization. I mean, that's where we're at right now, is trying to grapple with the impact of all those things coming together. And so, there's a way to misuse intersectionality. And I feel like that's what I see more of, is people using the term, but not really understanding how they're supposed to use it, or saying what they really actually want to say by using the term.
Yeah.
And so I think if we're understanding intersectionality as an analysis, that this is how you can understand oppression, I think that alone can really help people with coming up with titles or coming up with presentations. Because I see a lot of things, for example, when I teach my class, I give some examples of, bad use of the term or misuse of the term. So things like the intersectionality of self-care and BDSM. And it's like, actually, those are not, that's not how you do it, right? Like that's a misunderstanding of intersectionality, but a great opportunity to make that an intersectional conversation. So this idea that, intersectionality started with Black women in the way that we understand it through Kimberly Crenshaw is totally true. Yeah. And if we take an interdisciplinary look at the intersectional work that's occurred, women and gender studies, sociology, all of the Black, Indigenous, people of color who are scholars in those fields, we're also doing a lot of intersectional work. And a lot of people might be familiar with the book, This Bridge Called My Back. Mm-hmm. That's a really great example of an intersectional piece of work. Yeah. You have so many different voices. They're talking about really complicated experiences, from immigration to displacement to love to language. And that's a really great example of an intersectional text that's also interdisciplinary. And so you had Black feminists who were also talking about an intersectional analysis, but weren't calling it that. So you'll hear references to like Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination, which comes out of her Black feminist thought theory. And that's a really great example of something that also guided Kimberly Crenshaw's understanding as well, as a Black woman in the United States who strongly identifies as a Black feminist. Black feminist thought definitely honors that that approach and that analysis for Black people. And I think, there's a lot of purists, I call them, who want intersectionality to only be used by Black women, only to understand Black women's work. And that does come from a Black feminist thought understanding, where Black women are the ones who will be able to find the solutions to their own problems, because they need to talk to each other and we need to listen to them. And that's really the framework that follows a variety of different justice frameworks, right? If we look at reproductive justice, disability justice, media justice, all of it centers the people who are most under-resourced and most impacted negatively by the systems that they're operating in. And so that's a really common piece of intersectionality that I think kind of gets lost in a way, but also doesn't mean that only Black people get to use this, this theory or this approach.
Yeah, I thank you for giving some really concrete examples. That was helpful for me, and I hope folks viewing are like, okay, we're getting this. I wanted to kind of go into exploring the critique a little bit further of intersectionality, and specifically, where some of the arguments are coming from, stating, intersectionality can be harmful for individual causes, and some of the examples are, if a trans woman of color is facing racism, then it must be racism, right? Or if a woman is facing transphobia, then it must be transphobia. And so in this vein, many people believe that their identities are separate in nature, and that it's dangerous to lump all of us under one issue, right? And so and naturally, I mean, you shared a little bit of that in your last response, and I was hoping, when this comes up, when you're teaching your intersectionality class, for example, if it did come up there or elsewhere, what do you say to those folks who are making this kind of argument?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tell them that they're right because they're thinking about oppression. And I
Yeah.
think that's really what intersectionality wants us to do, is think about it, and not just about our own experiences, but what are the experiences that other people are having. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, you and I come from different communities. We have different experiences. And I have no doubt in my mind that you've been harmed
Yeah.
because of a particular experience or identity or place that you come from. And so what does it mean that you and I can collaborate and do something together and honor each other's resistance and
Yeah.
survival and be able to build from there, right? Like those
Yeah.
are the ways that I think we really can help people understand this overwhelming, I mean, it's overwhelming, like the world is on fire. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's a really scary space for a lot of people. And to think about theory, it's very ethereal. Like you can't touch it, you can't really smell it. Like, what does it look like? How do I do it? Am I wrong? My whole body feels warm when I talk about race.
Yeah.
Things, those are real responses to what's going on and to oppression. And so I think it's important to not just take the theory, but also say and remind people that the practice can look like our bodies feeling something. It doesn't need to always look like, oh, here's a solution. And that's something that I think people expect of intersectionality is a solution, but that's not what an intersectional approach offers us. It offers us a guide. It offers us steps on what to take and the different questions that we get to ask. But it's not giving us solutions or a justice approach to finding, how can we make this path something that's more equitable for all people. That's not really what it's offering us. Instead, it's offering us the steps to begin to get there. And that to me is really important. It's a guide, but it's not the end result. And so in many ways, the work that Kimberly Crenshaw laid out, as well as other feminists in other disciplines, they really gave us, not just through their storytelling and their artwork, but also through just the language that they use, how one language is alive and it's always changing. So when you asked me this question, I thought immediately of, the term trans misogynoir, right? And so the term misogyny has been shifted by brilliant Black feminist Moya Bailey into misogynoir to talk about the specific ways that Black women experience misogyny. And then you have trans misogynoir, right? How Black women who are transgender also experience misogyny in a very particular way. So the language evolves, and it's a commitment, really. I think at the end of the day, it's a commitment to being focused and being astute. So being clear about I just had this very visceral response to someone talking about immigration. Why do I have that? Oh, I'm a child of immigrants. Oh, people don't see Puerto Ricans as immigrants, even though it's the entire system of otherness that they still enter into when they show up in the United States, right? So there's many different ways that our bodies remind us of the oppression and the survival that we've gone through. And that is a piece that I think isn't always honored when talking about diversity and inclusion work. And sometimes it really gets tied up with, I don't want to cry. I don't want to cry. Right? Crying in front of my colleagues, I'm going to be embarrassed, or people won't take me seriously. Or I'll lose respect, or whatever it is, right? I mean, being vulnerable at work is hard for so many reasons. But I think being in a space that honors how our bodies respond to what's going on not only embraces a disability justice approach, which says that no body is disposable, but it also allows us to remember, hey, let me step back here and see what are the things that I can offer that are supportive of this person's experience and also doesn't make them feel like they can't ever return. I remember crying at work and not being able to stop crying when I heard a colleague make a rape joke. And, I was very young in my career. I was 25 years old, and I just left for the day. And I couldn't talk about why I was shaking or why, just hearing that joke in the workplace. It wasn't even directed, it wasn't even told to me. I just overheard it from someone in the next cube. Those are I couldn't talk to people about what was happening and why it was wrong. And people's instant response was, oh, you survived a rape. And it's one, it doesn't matter if I did, but also it's the reality that we live in a workplace where people think that rape culture is funny and acceptable. And your response to me bringing this up to you is, oh, you've survived something. And
Right.
it's like, I'm surviving coming to this job every day. Like,
Yes.
that's the thing that I'm surviving right now.
Right.
And so an intersectional analysis for like the supervisor in that situation that I had could have been something like, what do you need to be able to be
Yeah.
here? You know, what are the ways that we can create a culture among our team members where joking is welcome and where laughter is something that we honor as a coping mechanism, because that's something very familiar from many oppressed communities. And
Right.
how can we also say certain things aren't funny?
Yes.
And when we joke about them, it impacts all of us negatively, because what does it mean if we can't have Bianca show up because she's constantly shaking because she can't trust this colleague
Yeah.
to, you know, whatever. Those are real life experiences of what an intersectional approach and analysis can really help us understand. But it's really up to us to take the next steps and figure out what the solution will be.
Yeah, so there's so much goodness that you just shared in that response, and I think just kind of going to kind of having humor in the workplace and really getting clear on what a workplace's values are and what is not okay, you know, and kind of
Right.
leading with that, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that having a, you know, the ideal supervisor checking in when you are being vulnerable, and like you said, I really like what you said about, you know, honoring how our bodies respond, you know, both in the workplace and in our lives, right? But
Mm-hmm.
having other people having that emotional intelligence to be like, okay, something is up, and being curious enough to be there to support, and then to do the right, you know, to do the best that a
Mm-hmm.
supervisor or anyone in that position could do to
Mm-hmm.
kind of just address what was happening and address the harm that was done, and working on a repair that
Mm-hmm.
kind of brings people back together, right? And makes you
Mm-hmm.
feel like you have a sense of belonging. And it sounded like at 25
Right.
you didn't have that experience, right?
Right. Yeah. And
Um,
I didn't have the
yeah,
language either. So it
yeah,
also speaks to like the language, like what could I have said that would have allowed my significantly older supervisor to understand what was going on, who
yes,
was also a woman of color. You know what I mean? So it was
sure,
really, it's everybody that's impacted. And
yeah,
I think it's the one thing I think is harmful with a couple of critiques around intersectionality would be that,
yeah,
you know, if only Black women are supposed to use it or do it or have the focus be on them, there's this assumption that Black women then know how to use and talk about intersectionality. That's
right,
just not true. It's not fair to have that quote unquote positive stereotype
mm-hmm.
attached to you, because, you know, I just think alone, the mental health alone of what
Mm-hmm.
someone says to themselves, of psyching themselves out for like continuing professional development,
Yeah,
or for feeling like they said something wrong, or, you know, just the mental gymnastics that people go through when trying to validate themselves
yeah,
in a situation where they feel inadequate. And that's the kind of harm that I think can definitely happen, because a lot of us aren't trained. You know what I mean? There isn't like an intersectionality course necessarily. I mean, there is now because I made one,
thank you.
but you
Yeah,
know, but like that's, you know, this is a word that came from the academy and is being
yeah,
used now in popular culture.
yes,
And a lot of the meaning has really been, I don't want to say erased, but people don't read, you know, like law journals for fun. You know, it's a very different
it's
understanding.
a little dry. Yeah,
Yeah, just a smidgen and
yeah,
very long. But you know, it's one of those things where I think it's important to say out loud that just because you are a Black woman does not mean that you know intersectionality. It's not, we're not born with knowing that kind of thing. And
yeah,
so I think it's important to speak and to speak on it and say, yes, I understand this stems from Black women's labor, examining Black women's care, and what are the ways that we can support Black women if that's the
yeah.
approach we're going to understand.
Yeah, yeah. And I really liked how you were talking about in this argument of recognizing that this idea, this concept of intersectionality is a guide to helping us pinpoint where oppression lives, right? And that's helpful, and that the term itself has evolved. The way that we kind of talk about our own experiences, and perhaps how we feel oppressed in different ways, is it helps us get more savvy about understanding each other and kind of building connection across difference. And so, kind of thinking about the folks who are tuning into this particular talk, many folks are doing the work of kind of taking an organization's commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion. Now we're hearing belonging more often in the workplace. Do you believe that the idea of intersectionality it can be a goal to work towards. I've seen that mentioned and kind of more in pop culture, right? So again, is this like a misuse of understanding intersectionality, as you say, as a guide, or can we, in doing this work, have intersectionality, the guide, that be kind of our goal that we continue to work towards, to just recognize that oppression will show up in different ways. And we have this framework now to kind of better understand where it shows up and how it may or may not be connected to other forms of oppression.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I see this coming up for many organizations is that they'll say something like, we're using an intersectional, we're guided by intersectionality and we do this work, and, and what they're really trying to say is our staff represents the communities that we work with.
Yeah.
Right. And so so sometimes you don't need to have that jargon of intersectionality to really say what you mean. And then there's another way of saying, for example, if there's like a job description for like an ED and the board of directors are interviewing for that position. And, in the call, it says, we're looking for candidates who can speak eloquently about intersectionality. I think that's fair. But I also think of, what do those board of directors know about intersectionality? How do they understand it? Because sometimes there's a disconnect. So there's the desire of the organization, there's the desire of the workers, there's desire of the board. And so sometimes those things don't always connect, but it's possible for them to always connect. And I think what is important is for people and organizations to allow themselves to be guided by an understanding of oppression that is multidimensional. It's not just one-dimensional or one person's experience. And that allows them to guide the work that they do. I don't think that an organization that just says, oh, we use the intersectional analysis, period, and we're done, that they're actually going to meet their goals, whatever their goals might be around diversity and inclusion. So I think today, unfortunately, it is a buzzword, and it becomes a word that might be a sign of suspicion for some people. I know, I hear a lot of my activists and organizer communities that there are organizations who are using the language but aren't really doing the work. And what that looks like to them is they're using the intersectional analysis, but they're not recognizing that, oh, when you still pay all of your administrative assistants less than the minimum wage, and you know that all of them are college students or single parents, what does that mean for the project manager or, whoever else? Is there a way to move up in the organization? How do you fairly assess people's success in the organization? It really is an internal reflection of looking at policies, procedures, and being able to create them too. That's how I support organizations in wanting to use an intersectional analysis, is saying this is what it looks like to do this right now. And it doesn't mean that you're not intersectional. It just means that you need to really step back and see, okay, why is there $100,000 discrepancy between the ED and the next, COO or whatever it is, ask about those things. And honestly, that's the hard stuff that people are very emotional about money. And that makes it difficult to really use a framework like this, because a lot of people don't understand it. But when you begin to dive a little bit deeper, you realize that, okay, Black feminist thought, which guides intersectionality, Patricia Collins talks about the anger that Black women hold and how that anger is a place of action. And I think that's something that is really difficult to understand when you already feel like you're being underpaid in your organization, when you don't need another backpack. You really would have loved a $500 gift certificate or something, or a check or whatever. I think those are some of the major things where I remind people that your staff want money, they want time off, they want to be treated like human beings. And if you're struggling with understanding that, it's not an intersectional analysis that you need, it's a completely different analysis that you might need, whether it be understanding capitalism differently, or whether it be there needs to be a human rights understanding. But sometimes intersectionality isn't going to help reveal a solution or help someone understand what's going on. Sometimes what people need is understanding of the feminization of poverty, not so much intersectionality.
I really like what you're saying about kind of just saying what you mean and then doing the thing, right? So you kind of described an organization taking an intersectional approach, and you use the great example of staff reflecting the communities they're serving, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
getting clear on what type of leader, executive director you want to have who, as you said, speaks eloquently about intersectionality, rather than like pinpointing what are examples of talking about building coalition across communities, or whatever the skills are for the executive director.
Mm-hmm.
Those examples are really helpful in your own work, kind of using intersectionality as a guide. What might be some examples that could be helpful for those of us leading work inside of organizations to try to recognize there are groups of people in our organization who are historically underrepresented, undervalued, not compensated? You use some great examples of just like compensation transparency. What might be some examples that can help those folks think about kind of connecting those dots and lifting up the realities of what's happening in the workplace when there's lip service about, we want to include everyone, we want everyone to belong, and yet there's a lack of leadership in addressing what those systemic barriers are that are taking place, that are impacting multiple groups of people, not particularly just one, right?
Yeah, I think this is a really great opportunity for people to examine power. And that is why we need such important people in positions of power that have decision-making power, being able to understand this analysis and understanding in general power and how it shifts constantly. Because those, entry level or, support staff, they already know. So there's one thing if like an ED takes staff out to lunch who are, at the entry level position and asks them for their ideas, that's not compensating someone, right? That's taking someone to lunch.
Yep.
If you really want to compensate people for the time that they're offering, which is our greatest commodity that we can give and share, asking them, what hourly rate do you want? Giving them a bonus. We live in a capitalist society, and I feel like I know I'm talking a lot about money. There are organizations that, people want like a massage, or people want, a 3-day weekend or whatever it is. It's really being able to understand, what do people want? And what do they want that will keep them happy and fulfilled doing the work at the space that they're already at. And for many people, it's money. For some people, it's other things. Maybe they need like a grocery card. Maybe they need a new car, whatever it is. There's so many ways to be creative in those types of opportunities. But what I often see is the former of just, let me take you out to lunch. And buying someone like a $20 sandwich is not the same as understanding the power that you have and how to strategically use that power. And to be the person at an organization that has a position of power, I've definitely been in those. And what ends up happening is you do have a variety of the entry level or the one person from this community who comes to you as the person that they trust in the organization because they see a sameness and they hope that there might be some respect there. And, being able to understand, okay, these people have come to me, I have this knowledge and information, they've told me what they wanted, now let me take this to the person who can actually make it possible, and I can package it in a way that this person can understand, and I can ask for the compensation or the retribution that people need or have requested. And so that to me is so powerful. And that is something that can make people's palms sweat just thinking about it, right? It's hard to be the person with a certain amount of power in an organization. It just is, period. And that's probably one of the reasons why so many of my friends have been like, I can't be an executive director. It's scary, And I love that there's now a movement of having co-directors because I think that can be so much more realistic with people's abilities. And that's also a great way to like hold each other accountable and be able to know how to apologize to each other in a way that's real. Those are the things that I think are really essential. And they're like human things, like those are the stuff that we learn when we're very young children, but we forget that we're talking to another human being, and we forget that this human being could have a completely different experience that we don't know about. And so how do we want to treat them right now is really important. And so it comes from like this humanist, and not so much a human rights thing, but if we're talking about minimizing harm, because I think financial exploitation is an example of harm, we really need to definitely take a collective approach. And this is also part of like safety planning. I talk about safety planning a lot. especially as someone who has grown up in states that are strict firearm states, but I now travel to different states that are very open carry supportive. And so what do I do as someone who's afraid of people who have guns when I'm the trainer in the room? And these are people who have paid. And, so that kind of safety planning comes up. And this is also part of safety planning, I believe, is how do we compensate people? How do we care for people at this organization without using that language of family? Oh, we're all a family. And I know that might be controversial for some people listening, but people really like familial language, and other people feel that it's a performance and that people don't really care for them. And so I think we all need to really reflect on what are the things that we need and why are we here. And I think if we ask our workers that, a lot of them, if we're completely able to get them to be honest, they would probably say, I need a job. And this is the closest thing to what I enjoy. And it's not so bad. And you pay me on time. And people will find reasons to stay employed versus reasons to be honest. And, honesty is hard. Radical honesty is even harder. But if you are in that position of power, I think gratitude is great for the people who have come to you, thanking them. And then also having your own strategic inner circle that can hold you accountable. I think that's something that I do often if I have to show up to like galas or fundraising spaces where I know that I'm like working the event, right? That I'm not really like a guest. I invite like 2 or 3 friends to come and, I'll schmooze and I'll put on, the code switching language that I need to. And then I'll turn around and I'll go and talk to my homies for like 10 minutes and just get a debrief and go back and work the room again. And I think there's very strategic ways that we can find support to continue to do this work when we have this kind of power. I think that's really important, especially for people in senior management positions, especially in the nonprofit industrial complex, where there's just this competition between executive directors that really exists because of capitalism. But I know of so many EDs that just are lonely and don't have other EDs to really talk to about the work that they're doing, about the care that they're taking to support people. And so, thinking about who's supported is also really important, because even our most senior people need that kind of care. And sometimes they don't realize it. Sometimes they don't want to. And I think that's when it's time to, reflect on, transitioning out of a position in a gentle way and allowing for people who are able to carry this work into another space in the time that we're in. I think that's also another big thing is like quote unquote founder syndrome and how that shows up.
Yeah. I really love your response to this. So you've given us some really kind of concrete examples of taking this idea of intersectionality, but thinking about it as it relates to our work, and recognizing that there are a lot of folks tuning in to the summit who carry a great deal of power and privilege in the positions that they have. And so I liked what you were saying about examine your own power. Hold yourself accountable by surrounding yourself with other stakeholders in the organization, at all levels, from all different backgrounds, right? Because that's going to help you kind of pinpoint and map out where inequities might exist, right? And then, this concept of, it can be lonely at the top, or if you, and in particular, there's a lot of folks who are tuning in who they might be the chief diversity officer and they're an office of one, and they might be twisting in the wind because all of the challenges of why the organization isn't inclusive enough sits on their shoulders. Right. And without a group, a peer support of other people in similar positions, that is hard. That is very hard. There's a lot of emotional labor to it. So if it's not already built in for you, coming to things like this or building community, in your region with other folks in similar positions, building it yourself sometimes can give you that kind of support that you need. To use intersectionality, the buzzword, but using it as a guide, like you said, to kind of pinpoint where inequities are in your organization and getting support from others who may have similar challenges, and you get to kind of troubleshoot or problem solve together, or rather build something better together.
Right.
That's
Absolutely.
like more innovative. So I wanted to shift a little bit and go back to this idea of silos and doing the work. And So out here in the Pacific Northwest, which isn't too far from where you are in Oakland, there is a very, very strong commitment to center diversity, equity, and inclusion work rightfully around racial equity. And in the state of Oregon, there's a lot of history to why that's really, really important. And yet, when I see folks leading on this work, some folks, the commitment to center racial equity, it kind of stops at then kind of looking within communities of color around folks who are most vulnerable, right? So folks who are immigrants or folks with people with disabilities, LGBT folks, et cetera. And so what guidance would you have when there is a very strong call to action addressing just racism in the workplace, right? And that's something I think every person tuning in right now is wanting to address in some way or another. But how do you encourage folks when they're centering, a diversity, equity, and inclusion program around racial justice to resist kind of siloing that work or not seeing connections to kind of folks within communities of color who are really vulnerable?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because that's why the conference Facing Race exists. So if people haven't been there, I would encourage them to go, and I would imagine that many people in the Pacific Northwest know that already because they go. I've met them. And I think, so there's a couple of things I'm thinking when you ask this question. The first thing is, good job. Like, you all are doing the work, and this is one of many steps. And it's going to be hard. Like, it's not always joy and pirouettes down the hall, and like it's going to be hard and heavy work, and that's no matter what path you take when it comes to justice. So I would say that affirm the work because it is needed. I would then also ask them, how are they defining justice? Like, what does justice mean for them, for the organization? If they haven't done that work yet, I would encourage them to do it collectively. They might need some consultants for that kind of work. But this is the opportunity to dream big. Like, for some people, justice looks like equities. For some people, justice looks like, liberation and remote work. I mean, there's so many different ideas, but it's really important, just as you come up with your own mission, values, and goals for the organization, come up with an understanding of justice and see how it fits into what you're trying to do at the organization. And I think that's where it's going to really hit hard when you start really embedding it into the structure of the organization, because those structures are going to reveal themselves as not being stable to support racial justice. And you have to also come up with a plan to figure out what to do when that happens, because a lot of people think, oh, well, then just fire the person and hire. That's not going to happen. Hey, let's just be real about it. Like, it's illegal. And so that's not the solution. Instead, the solution is, what do we do at this organization? And why is it that we can't retain people of color or people with disabilities or queer people at this organization? That's the real hard question. How does heterosexuality constantly show up at this organization and we focus on clean drinking water? You know what I mean? Like, that's something that really, those are the hard questions. And even though they sound very simple when I put them together in a sentence, that, a lot of people aren't ready to do that kind of astute self-reflection. And that's why I tell people, yes, this is what you do at work, but it also needs to be the work that you do at home as well. Like, if your entire circle is people exactly like you, and that's how you want to keep it, then doing the justice work might not be exactly where you need to be right now. And it's okay to step back. It's okay to be honest about where you're at, right? Like, and I think that's the hard part is, forcing people to do things when they're not ready. That creates a lot of conflict and a lot of feelings of resentment, and doesn't make for any kind of harmony in the workplace at all. But I think that's a form of resistance that a lot of people hold on to. So there's ways to gently push people, but that's why we have to come back to strategically using your power and your privilege in those ways. It takes a minute. It doesn't always click for everybody as it does with others. Like, somebody said to me, oh, the phrase colorblind racism is ableist. And I instantly understood why. But there's other people who are like, no, it's not. It's, they need support to understand that. And if they choose to not listen to whoever has told them that, that's their choice. And understanding what are the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's part of the evaluation process for organization. When we evaluate our peers individually or people who we supervise, is it a reciprocal evaluation? Do the people get to, share their thoughts about the person that supervises them or that oversees them? Like, how does that look? And are people comfortable? How is it done anonymously, right? Like, what is the care that people are able to do? And I think that's going to get difficult as people, understand the relationships that organizations have with like HR. HR is another really hard place to work, I think, doing the racial equity work. And that's period. That's the sentence. Right? Being HR, diversity and inclusion is hard.
Yes.
And it's hard, especially if the organization does not have a clear vision of what this racial justice outcome is for them. Maybe racial justice outcome is we're going to get 200, students who just turned 18 signed up for voting registration. If that's their end goal, there are ways to implement the racial justice approach. And then also, how to deal with failure, because y'all are going to fail. I'm just going to tell you straight up, this, plot twist failure, it's going to happen. And how are you going to respond to it? How are you going to be ready to manage the failure? And that's also a little bit of like safety planning that I support orgs and people in doing, because, when people are harmed, the impact is immediate. And people really want, the person who's been harmed really usually wants someone to recognize the harm, to speak on it, affirm that it's happened, that they believe them, and to be given the what's next, kind of, what can I expect? And I think a lot of times like HR follows this very rigid process that does uphold tactics and ideals of white supremacy. And as someone who's been on both sides of that, nobody comes out stronger in the end when that kind of conflict arises and HR has no process to look at. I see that kind of process also happening in open network spaces in like IT, where there's lots of targeting that's happening online. And a lot of these organizations are like, what do I do? How do we, come up with these comments? And how do we make sure that should we ban someone? How do we know if this person's not stalking? All of these things that come up. And those are real things that are happening across the globe. And people aren't ready and they don't have a system in place for how to support the people who might be harmed. And so when we say the word harm, I think people, imagine certain scenarios, but it's a shapeshifter. Harm looks so many different ways. And, one of the things I like to remind people is that, safety is a community responsibility. It's not just one person's responsibility. It's a collective response. And that requires everybody to be down for, recognizing, thinking about, and speaking on what they witness and what they're willing to do.
Yeah. I really like what you're saying about getting clear on what your goals are when starting to do this work. So kind of recognizing you've made the commitment, you're centering your approach around racial justice, if that's the case, if that's where you're starting from, but getting clear on what that looks like. And one thing there's many things I like about your Anti-Up website, going to your Imagine statement. I love that, right? Just kind of like centering, like if you can dream big, like what you were saying, what does an organization look like in the future that is one that has centered racial justice when you've succeeded, right? And just kind of avoid the temptation of like, here's all the things that are getting in the way. Like, what does it look like? Because the more clear you can be, it's, maybe a little woo for the crowd, but, that's part of manifesting. And like what you said too, there are steps that you can work towards where you're setting goals that might be more bound by the number of students, young people that you want to get registered who are young people of color, 18 that just turned 18, right? 200, that's the goal that you're working towards. So you achieve it, but it's a step towards getting to that big Imagine statement. And like a thought that came up for me when you were sharing this like really great advice is, this piece of doing that work is sometimes hard because in order to innovate and dream big, you kind of have to have that feeling of belonging to begin with, to trust your colleagues of like, okay, I'm going to brainstorm with you. I'm going to throw out a wild idea. But there's that fear that is also there of like, are people going to judge me? Or, I mean, all of the things that kind of get in the way of innovation. And so I'm wondering, and maybe this ties into the safety plan that you're talking about, what are things that we can do, recognizing that, it takes some folks a while to trust, or maybe there isn't trust there because there has been harm that's been done in the past that never was properly addressed. Kind of thinking about workplaces like that, do you have any suggestions of how to kind of set the environment to when you're ready to do kind of the imagining work, right? Like what kind of steps need to be, what does the environment need to look like for folks to kind of have faith in each other, or try to reestablish faith in each other to get there?
Yeah, I think for people who've gone to Facing Race, they've seen how like Facing Race has incorporated art and its many manifestations into the work that they do.
Yeah.
And so I would say, the creativity that you're talking about that gets stifled, I think it happens because the creativity isn't honored in other ways, right? Like if you walk into a space that has all white walls and two posters, sharing about, the services, that's a very clinical feel. And so what it feels like when you walk into a space that makes you take a breath and just sigh out, right? A sigh of relief. And so, thinking about what those look like, maybe it's even like a smell, like this is using all of our senses. And that's the thing that I think is really important, because it also, again, brings in a disability justice approach where you get to honor the ways that people's bodies are able to give us information. And so, like my dad's a real estate agent, and, he's always like, baking, a nice patch of fresh baked cookies is always nice, or some bread to really try to sell the house. And, it's true for that field. Is it true also for, the people who are doing more climate change work? What does it look like to walk into your space and smell lavender or rose or whatever? You know what I mean? Like thinking about that kind of fully sensual experience, I think is really important, and something that we don't always nurture. And so if we're able to do that, I think it'll be a little bit easier to encourage people to imagine bigger. Because I do this kind of work with young people, especially queer young people who often have a hard time imagining a future for themselves. I created a activity sheet, and I'm happy to send it to you, and you can post it, and all that good stuff. Where it's called the Afterworld Worksheet, and so it's like your ancestors in 300 years are gonna pick up the whatever the plate about you. What are the things you want them to know? What are like some of your greatest accomplishments? Who in your community or family do people say that you remind them of? Or these kinds of ways that we don't always talk to people, but if we're giving people a question about what are the top 5 songs that were important to your life before you left this world, write them here so people know about you. I think that's the kind of quiet work that sometimes we need to do. We do a lot of hard work quietly. And I think as an educator, honoring that silence is really important. And as a facilitator, I tell people all the time, I'm gonna ask you hard questions, and we can sit here in silence for 15 minutes until somebody has a thought that they want to share. Like silence isn't bad. Silence isn't negative. I like to complicate silence. And so being able to give someone a worksheet, and invite them to think about what future they can have, I think is a really great entry into that. And it's something that sometimes we get a little bit of that if we have a good mentor, but it's not really the way that we're nurtured to become employees and to become innovators. And so that's something I think is really missing, and that can really easily be inserted. And it's funny because I have this worksheet because I created it for a curriculum that I was hired to do, but they were like, no, let's not do that activity. And they just did, and I get it, like they just didn't know how to facilitate that conversation. And I get it, people need the training and the support, and they also need to go through it themselves to have a more social, emotional understanding of that kind of activity, especially for young people. But I think for adults, it's very easy to understand why you're doing that activity. And it's something that can be very individual, like you don't have to share your answers. And I think being able to remind people that they get to have this hard this hard work that they get to do silently and quietly at work that they're paid for is important. And it's an activity to start getting us into the feel of, okay, what does liberation look like? What does freedom look like? And it's okay if all of us have different ideas, because that's really what liberation can mean for people, being able to have your own vision of body autonomy and liberation, and it not interfere with anybody else's, right? And that's really hard to achieve, period. Like there's always going to be something coming out, hence intersectionality.
Yes.
But but I just think it's really, really important to remind people that, dreaming isn't an activity that's not worthy, or an activity that you do when you zone out. Like it's definitely something that is embedded. And I think I love reading science fiction because it allows me to imagine a different future that I haven't imagined. And so I think that's also something that many of us, I know I find myself in this space where I'm like, why do I want to live on the planet another 25 years? Like, do I need a gas mask? Like what kind, how are we going to prepare?
Right.
It's scary to think about the future, but it's also important to remember that, okay, before I become some stardust, what do I still have left that I really want to do? Like what legacy do I really want to have? And what am I willing to do to meet those goals?
Yeah, I love that. And as you were describing the activity, my body response, I was getting goosebumps. I'm like, this is beautiful. And it's an extension of ourselves, and I love that you're doing that work with queer young people. Right. And just, I think an extension of folks who are tuning in, it's, thinking about yourself and what you want your ancestors to know 300 years from now. And kind of, if we're thinking about our organizations, which are made up of many people, how do we want our organizations to be remembered, and the impact, hopefully the positive impact that we're having, and maybe turning course if we're feeling like we're not having the kind of impact we want to be remembered for. And I think that's really, really good guiding advice, and kind of taking this concept of intersectionality as a guide. Having that worksheet to complement this conversation, I think, is very generous. So thank you for sharing that. We've talked a lot about intersectionality and kind of breaking it down. What might be one thing that we haven't yet covered that you feel really strongly you want to kind of send the audience off with, just to kind of think a little bit further, and in kind of taking this abstract concept and kind of breaking it down into concrete actions that we can do after today?
Yeah, I would encourage people that if they're struggling with how to implement an intersectional analysis in their work, to remind them that this is lifelong work. Like if you don't get it done by Friday, it's still going to be there. Unfortunately or fortunately, however you view that. And, taking your time isn't a bad thing. Being sure that this is the work that you want to do and clear that this is the path is important, but it's also important to think about, like, okay, what's your failure plan? And when I say that, like, who are the people that you're going to go to find support? Who's going to really talk straight to you and say, listen, you fucked up. Oops. And then what? How can we support you? Who do you need to apologize to, if anyone? And what apology do you need to give yourself? And those are the things that I think are really important when it comes to intersectionality, because it's not perfect. We're not perfect. Humans made it. We're all flawed in certain ways. And so I really want to encourage people to divest in this idea that intersectionality is perfect. It's not. It's a tool. And when we use it well and we allow it to guide us, we can really have amazing outcomes and experiences. And intersectionality isn't where it ends, right? Like if people are interested in, pursuing different kinds of knowledge and seeing where intersectionality can evolve, I would say look at theories of power. And sometimes those come right out of like theologians who are in divinity practices, and for some of us who are atheists, or some of us who are of a particular religious group, we might not feel comfortable doing that. But if you think it's about power, and if people are able to think about the power and the relationships that they have with like their creator or the planet or whoever God is, like that's important to also recognize as a form of power. And that's also one of the most intimate relationships people might have for their whole lives. So it's also an important thing to consider in general, I think. And then finally, I would encourage people to remember that intersectionality is about relationships, the relationships that we have with our own identities, the relationship that those identities result in when we move through the world, and the relationships that we have with other people. That really is intersectionality at the end of the day. And Yeah, I hope that was
But
helpful for some people who feel
yeah,
such
this
a
was amazing. I
okay,
loved everything you shared, and I know that it's been super helpful for me in the work that I do. And I hope your words are inspiring other people to keep going and to recognize the work is messy. You know, there's not a kind of playbook of this is the cookie cutter approach. And I like that you're recognizing that in doing the work. I mean, if we're doing anything that matters, we will fail at some point, and that's not an end to the work. It's just there's a seed of opportunity when we stumble, and you know, just by getting back up and kind of reflecting on what happened and how we might be able to change course. That's a good thing. So it's giving us kind of like information points of like where to go next,
right,
and just having a plan around that, just kind of recognizing we are human and that's part of the experience for better or worse, and
right,
that's okay.
yeah,
So I loved everything that you're sharing, Bianca,
right.
and you're doing awesome work. So I imagine that there's a lot of people really inspired and want to connect with you. So where might be the best place online that we can find you?
Yeah, I'd love for people to find me at anteuppd.com. And that's spelled ANTEUPPD.com.
Yeah,
And I say it like that because it's not anti, right? It's
yeah,
Ante Up, the famous
yeah,
poker. And that's because, you know, when you're playing poker, if you ever watch people play poker, when people ante up, they put all their chips in and they're like, I'm
yeah,
going all in for this bet. And I
yeah,
think it's time that we have to just put our whole selves in to be able to do this work and have the outcomes that we want. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
This was great. So we'll definitely share that in the materials along with your worksheet. So for everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us for this talk. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, there was a lot of good information shared today. If you'd like additional resources for doing this work, like the worksheet that Bianca is sharing with us, or if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out all of those options for getting extended access to this session and others by using the link below. So for every purchase, it also helps me pay for speakers like Bianca for their generosity, wisdom, and labor in helping us grow the belonging movement. So thank you. And thanks again, Bianca, for being today's featured belonging champion.
thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.